All right, hello everybody, and welcome again to another episode. This one continuing our series over the American Civil War. And last time we had discussed the origins of the conflict, and so today we're going to start talking about the actual battles and everything that will occur over the course of the next 4 years in the American Civil War. But anyways, before we start discussing today's topic over the firing on Fort Sumter, I would like to remind everybody that if you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment, as well as subscribe to the channel. I always love hearing your guys' feedback, so do comment as much as possible. But anyways, with that said, we'll go ahead and get started about our discussion over the firing on Fort Sumter. All right, so in the last video, we had talked about the secession crisis that had begun in December of 1860 and it spilled over into the beginning of the year 1861. What we had seen is before Lincoln had taken office in March of 1861, we saw that 7 southern states had seceded from the Union. All of this beginning on December 20th, 1860, when we see South Carolina approve its ordinance of secession to break away from the Union. And so we're going to pick back up on our story, but start talking about the event that ultimately triggered the American Civil War, that surrounding the episode of the firing on Fort Sumter. Because while we did start to see the southern states secede from the Union, we weren't quite at war. We needed an event that would ultimately trigger that, and therefore that event would prove to be the firing on Fort Sumter. So let's pick back up at December 20th, 1860. We see that South Carolina has seceded from the Union. And with it, we see shortly thereafter, we're going to see that the South Carolinian governor, that of Francis Pickens, is going to demand that President James Buchanan hand over all federal property to the South Carolinian government. Effectively, what we're going to see is that James Buchanan is going to hesitate, and he's ultimately not going to hand over all federal property to the South Carolinian government. However, we will see that he will have a correspondence back and forth with the governor of South Carolina, that of Francis Pickens, stating that he would not have troops occupy some of the forts that were in, say, Charleston Harbor, most notably that of Fort Sumter. And so at the same time, as we were starting to see this correspondence emerge between the South Carolinian governor as well as the President of the United States, and as the secession crisis continues to heighten and begins to threaten the possibility of open hostilities, what we're going to see is that the federal garrison within Charleston, most notably at Fort Moultrie, just outside of Charleston, is going to look to prepare for the event that hostilities do emerge. Now, the federal garrison within Fort Moultrie is under the command of Major Robert Anderson. He was a graduate of the West Point class of 1825, and he had served gallantly during the Mexican-American War, being wounded at the Battle of Molino del Rey. However, after the Mexican-American War, what we ultimately see is that Major Robert Anderson, after gaining his brevet rank, he would go on to be an instructor at West Point, and we'll see how that plays a major role within this episode a little bit later on. But anyways, by the fall of 1860, with the threat of secession, he was ultimately appointed to command of 3 forts within Charleston Harbor. And effectively, he was seen as one of the more competent officers within the Union Army who could respond to this growing secession crisis within the region. And so on December 20th, as he receives word that South Carolina has voted to secede, he quickly realizes that hostilities aren't going to be far behind. By December 26, 1860, what we're going to see is he's going to make a crucial move, being stationed in Fort Moultrie, which was on the mainland of South Carolina. We're going to see that Major Robert Anderson is then going to withdraw his 85-man command, 2 companies of the 1st U.S. Artillery, and withdraw them back into Fort Sumter, this tiny little island, if you will, stationed in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And with this, what we're going to see is hostilities would only increase as the South Carolinian militia and later the Confederate government are going to try to take over Fort Sumter. After Major Robert Anderson has withdrawn to the fortifications of Fort Sumter, what we're then going to see is that another crisis is going to confront him. As I mentioned before, there is the threat of open hostilities against the fort, especially as we started to see the South Carolinian militia begin to stockpile and take over many of the forts surrounding Fort Sumter on the mainland South Carolina coastline. However, what we're going to also see is that while they were doing this, they were beginning to form an unofficial siege, if you will. They effectively cut off all routes of supply to Fort Sumter, and therefore what we're going to see is Robert Anderson quickly is going to run out of many of the munitions that he once had the luxury to have prior to this crisis. And quickly what we're going to see is he's going to begin to open correspondence with President Buchanan, asking for a resupply effort to be sent to Fort Sumter so that way it could effectively carry on its fight. They could continue to hold the fort. Now, James Buchanan, what we're going to see is in the second week of January, is going to respond to the pleas being sent to him for Major Robert Anderson. What we're going to see is Buchanan is going to send down south the Star of the West, which is going to have over 200 men on board that would help reinforce the fort, as well as crucial supplies. However, ultimately, what we're going to see is as the Star of the West begins to approach Fort Sumter, quickly the South Carolina militia are going to fire upon this vessel. And in effect, these could have been the first shots of the American Civil War. However, what we're going to see is that with this failed effort to resupply Fort Sumter, we're going to see that James Buchanan is not going to be up to the task, and he's ultimately going to do nothing in trying to respond to this growing threat in the South. One thing to understand about President Buchanan in these closing days of his administration, because remember, we're just a few months away from a new administration in the White House. James Buchanan, he's not trying to invoke a civil war. He doesn't want his legacy to be tarnished by the fact that under his administration we saw the outbreak of this conflict. He's only merely trying to delay it just long enough to where it'd be ultimately Lincoln's problem. But anyways, what we're going to see is following the failure to resupply the fort with the Star of the West, we're going to see that Anderson's situation is only going to grow more grim. By February of 1861, what we had seen is the formation of a new Confederate government. And quickly, what we're going to see is this new Confederate government is going to try to take over Fort Sumter, try to carry on the fight that we'd seen the South Carolinians begin earlier on in the year. What we're going to see is that by March 1st of 1861, the new president of the Confederacy, that of Jefferson Davis, is going to appoint the first general of the Confederate Army to take control of the situation within Charleston. He's going to send over one PGT Beauregard, who we'll become ever more familiar with in future episodes, who was a student of Robert Anderson's at West Point, who had studied artillery tactics under him. Ultimately, what we're going to see is Beauregard is going to be given the task of ultimately forcing Fort Sumter to surrender. However, in March of 1861, an important thing to recognize is that both sides were not trying to provoke hostilities. Even with a new administration that entered the White House on March 4th, President Lincoln was not trying to provoke any sort of crisis there. He was not trying to provoke the Confederates. Essentially, what he wanted to do was try to find a peaceful end to this crisis, as well as hopefully end the entire secession crisis itself. And therefore, what we're going to see is there's going to be constant negotiations between not him and Jefferson Davis, but rather between him and the South Carolinian government to try to ease the pressure on Fort Sumter to where he could resupply the fort and hopefully have South Carolina re-enter the Union. And largely what we're going to see is the reason he chooses to deal with South Carolina's governor is because he does not want to recognize the new Confederate government, because by doing so, it ultimately lead to perhaps other powers to recognize the Confederate government. He wanted to prove that it was illegitimate and it's this government of rebellion, and these are only one of the ways that he went about doing so. But anyways, just like what we had seen during the closing months of Buchanan's administration, we'll see that Lincoln likewise is going to receive a correspondence from Major Robert Anderson within Fort Sumter, giving him the grim realities of the situation. On March 4th, the same day that Lincoln takes office, what we're going to see is he's going to be given a letter written by Anderson stating that if he is not resupplied anytime in the near future, that he ultimately only has 6 weeks left of supplies, and therefore, if he's not resupplied, they would almost certainly have to surrender the fort. As I mentioned before, over the course of the next month, what we're going to see is Lincoln is going to try to bring about a peaceful solution to the growing crisis surrounding Fort Sumter. However, all of this is going to come to no avail. And finally, by the first week of April of 1861, what we're going to see is that Lincoln is going to send supplies down to Anderson within Fort Sumter and hopefully have Anderson carry on his position within the fort. So as Lincoln has decided that he's going to resupply Major Anderson within Fort Sumter, what we're also going to see is that Lincoln is going to continue to have a correspondence with the South Carolinian governor. He's going to send a letter that will be given to Governor Pickens on April 6th that's going to claim that an attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only, and that if such attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice, except in case of an attack on the fort. Effectively, what we'd see is he's trying to tiptoe himself within the situation. He wants to make sure that the South Carolinian forces, as well as the Confederate forces within the region, recognize that Lincoln was not trying to provoke war, but rather he was merely trying to resupply his troops within Fort Sumter. And therefore, any hostilities that would come about would certainly be because of Confederate efforts. Effectively, what we're going to see is that it will be the Confederates that will be the aggressor in the situation, especially as we see the orders being sent to PGT Beauregard from President Jefferson Davis. In the light of what Lincoln was attempting to do, what we're going to see is that Jefferson Davis is going to renew orders back to PGT Beauregard from the previous month, stating that he demand Major Robert Anderson to surrender Fort Sumter to the Confederates. However, this time, in early April of 1861, Davis is going to give Beauregard permission that if Anderson does reject their surrender proposals, that effectively Beauregard would have the authority to open fire on the fort and reduce it in order to have it fall to the Confederate cause. And then on April 11th, 1861, what we're going to see is Beauregard's then going to construct once again his surrender demands. He's going to send them off to Major Robert Anderson. However, what we're going to see is Anderson is going to send back his reply. He's going to reject Beauregard's attempt to have Fort Sumter surrender. Effectively, what we're going to see is with his orders from President Jefferson Davis, we'll see that Beauregard then is going to begin to fire upon Fort Sumter at 4:30 in the morning on April 12th, 1861, after he's informed Robert Anderson of his ultimatum. Effectively, what we're going to see is that over the course of the next 34 hours, there'll be a constant bombardment on the fort, to where we'll see over 6,000 South Carolinian militia, as well as Confederate forces, would continuously man numerous cannons all across Charleston Harbor. Effectively, what we're going to see is they're going to easily outgun the Union forces within the fort. Because remember, there was only about roughly 85 men stationed within the fort. And after 34 hours, we'll see that Robert Anderson would then raise the white flag and effectively surrender Fort Sumter 2:30 in the afternoon on April 13th of 1861. During the course of the bombardment, what we're going to see is not a single individual on either side is going to die, and the only casualties that are really going to be suffered as a result of this episode are going to be when, through the surrender demands, Anderson was able to successfully negotiate a surrender term with Beauregard to allow for a 100-gun salute. However, in the course of firing this 100-gun salute, we'll see that 3 U.S. soldiers would ultimately fall mortally wounded as a result of a cannon, or as a result of one of the magazines exploding. However, despite these casualties, this episode at Fort Sumter was relatively bloodless. However, it does not foreshadow the fighting that is to come in the next 4 years. With the firing on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861, effectively what we'd see is that Beauregard and the Confederate forces had unleashed the bloodiest conflict in American history. They could not have realized what they had started, especially over the course of the next 4 years. We'll see over 750,000 Americans will die, roughly 6% of the entire U.S. population. Effectively, what we'll see is the bloodshed would only begin, especially as we talk about more battles in the days and the weeks to come. But anyways, with that said, that brings us about an end to our discussion over the firing on Fort Sumter. And before we go ahead and end this topic, let's go ahead and look at something that Major Robert Anderson would say about the firing on Fort Sumter. However, ironically, what we're going to see is that Major Anderson would return to the fort 4 years later on April 14th, 1865. 4 years to the day after he had lowered the Fort Sumter flag. However, on this day, what we're going to see is that he would not be overshadowed in defeat like what we'd seen in 1861, but rather he would be a part of a celebration of Unionists, especially as they've recently won the American Civil War. And so let's look at the words that he had stated during this occasion just 4 years later. Anderson would state, "I am here, my friends and fellow citizens and brother soldiers, to perform an act of duty which is dear to my heart, and which all of you present appreciate and feel. Did I listen to the promptings of my own heart, I would not attempt to speak, but I have been desired by the Secretary of War to make a few remarks. By the considerate appointment of the honored Secretary of War to fulfill the cherished wish of my heart through 4 long years of bloody war, to restore to its proper place this very flag which floated here during peace before the first act of this cruel rebellion. Thank God I have lived to see this day, to be here to perform this perhaps the last act of duty to my country and this life." Effectively, as we can see, that despite his defeat in 1861, Anderson had become essentially a war hero throughout much of the war. As you could probably guess, he had long desired to return to Fort Sumter to once again fly the American flag above his old post. Effectively, he was able to do so. And with it, he couldn't know what would happen that same day on April 14th, 1865. As we'll see later that night, President Lincoln would be ultimately assassinated. With that said, I'll go ahead and end on those words in regards to our discussion over the firing on Fort Sumter. But anyways, if you've liked and enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, comment below, comment about who you believe may have been at fault in bringing about the first shots on the firing of Fort Sumter. But definitely comment on everything that we've talked about within this video. But anyways, guys, that's it for me. And if you want to reach out, talk anything, or talk more about history, feel free to reach out. Other than that, till next time.